Thank you, Rochelle, for chairing the session, and to Ali, my colleague, telling you a little bit about our app. This is switching gears a little bit to some empirical research that I've been doing with a host of amazing, incredible people, again, across the globe. And I think very much in the essence of Social Bridges, it's about not only crossing cultural, but also disciplinary boundaries. So I've had the input from people from various different cultures. We've got Anton Varlamov, who's helped us with our Russian cohort, Wenhan, who's been helping with our Chinese cohort, but also disciplinary boundaries. So we've obviously got neuroscientists, and I've also had some input from philosophers. So the talk I'm giving you today very much tries to capture the essence of Social Bridges. And I just want to thank all the people who've made this particular COVID study. You heard some of the other work that I've been working on from Yasmin Abra. But this is a study we've been working on the so-called hunger for touch, which I think very nicely captured by Anouk and Chris's talk. It seems to be a little bit more of a naive take on the issue at hand. And so although a quick Google search will give you far more countable topics on news articles talking about the so-called hunger for touch, what I'm going to try and tell you about today, and what I'm going to try and provide you with, is another piece to the puzzle to build up what I think is a more nuanced view of this so-called hunger for touch, the kinds of touch that we might be missing, and what impact that missing the touch we actually crave has on our subsequent touch behaviors and on our well-being. So I think the essence of what I'm going to try and convey to you, and I'm going to just hit you over the head with it over and over again, is, as Julia was saying, not just who is touching us, but also where. And I'm going to try and talk about those two components of contextual factors that maybe not only cover the positive sides of affective touch, that they relieve our stress and pain and build and maintain social bonds, help us feel connected with others, which is maybe what some of us are feeling at the moment, a lack of connection, and indeed not getting some of that stress relief that we typically get from affective touch. But also on the flip side, that there are indeed beyond these positive effects of social exchange through touch, also some potentially negative behaviors surrounding touch. And what I'm going to really try and say is that from a mechanistic point of view, that these evolutionary old CT fibres, maybe related to the similarly old olfactory sense, are actually a sort of defensive mechanism that either push us towards approaching or indeed avoiding further exchange with social agents as a function of how threatening they are. And that obviously links in with the other work I've been doing on interpersonal space and threat from COVID. Specifically with our data from this ongoing and longitudinal study into the changes of touch behavior and the impact this has had on our well-being, we've identified a sort of context and individual specific set of differences in whether we crave or indeed reject the touch of others, depending on how well we know them, so familiarity, and assumedly how well we can determine their potential threat. So what I'm hopefully going to tell you about is some of the research questions that this study, an ongoing study, have tried to answer, which is, how have our touch behaviors changed? Both in terms of how much touch we sort of seek out, but also how much we get. What are the effects this has had on our well-being? Do we all feel these effects in the same way? And will these effects be long-lasting? And that's obviously illustrated here by the fact that we are running a longitudinal study over 4 test phases. We started, as most of you did, around April, May 2020. And then collected data at 3 subsequent time points. We're currently in the 4th of those 4 phases. Who knows, perhaps we'll need a 5th. Originally, we had hoped to have 1 year post-COVID and have very much the pandemic behind us. As it turns out, we took a test phase 2 months after the onset of the lockdown here in Europe. We then took a second data sampling 6 months following that initial phase, where we thought we'd either be, again, beyond the pandemic or indeed in a potential winter-related second wave. And then, as I said, 1 year post onset. We've collected data from over 3,000 participants. That number is growing as we're continuing and coming to the close of our phase 4 data collection. We've collected it across 5 languages, not nearly as many as Alona's group, but we do have some nice data that we can hopefully compare and contrast across the groups here. And I very much hope that that's something we'll be doing. If you want a breakdown as a function of that participants, we can certainly talk about that later. But I want to just leap right in to our design, because we've obviously heard of a lot of studies that have been ongoing at the same time and collecting data in similar ways to answer similar questions. But what I hope I'm going to put forward today is a slightly different take on things, though definitely complementary. There are some very specific differences. There are very little differences in terms of everybody trying to, at least as a covariate, to control for, but maybe also to include in our models, which we do, capturing people's physical distancing and isolation. How many people are you in isolation with? So trying to capture the sort of size of social network, and who particularly are you living with? And are these people you'd feel comfortable being touched? And that's what's characterized here by this little figure of somebody putting their hand on there. So we sort of categorized who are you living with and are you comfortable being touched by them? Because obviously simply cohabiting doesn't necessarily mean that you're happy being touched with them. And I think that might be one of the differences between, for example, our study and Julia's. Another big difference is that we tried to capture things both at an implicit and an explicit level. So although we also use the Bessler longitudinal interpersonal touch picture questionnaire, and indeed contrast both stranger touch and familiar touch across different touch types, so that we get the subjective report. We also wanted an implicit measure of touch deprivation and have an attentional mode task, which I'll tell you a tiny bit about, because we phased it out after phase 1 to shorten things so that more people would comply and take part in subsequent follow-ups. But I'll tell you about that in a little bit. But we wanted to sort of stepwise go from what are your physical distancing measures? What impact has this had on the kinds of touch you receive? And then move on to what touch means to you, both through vicarious videos of touch, which some people have already talked about today, so I don't need to put out too much information about that, but also our version of the embodied task that Julia so perfectly put forward in her PNAS paper, in which we've sort of adapted not only in the app you've just seen, but also in a new tool for Gorilla, the online experimental platform, which I can also tell you about if time permits. But we wanted to do so across body zones to sort of, as a function of CT innovation, look for differences about where people are touched and what that touch means to them as a function of the amount of touch that they're receiving. And then, although causality is a difficult one, as we've heard already from Anouk today, we did want to see whether or not, as a function of these rewarding CT innovation touch that we've looked at both at the level of touch deprivation and then the rewarding value of touch, are people finding ways to cope with compensatory rewarding behaviors as listed here, and how well are they coping, looking at changes in mood and well-being as captured with 4 very simple report measures. So let's just go into each of those parts of the study in a little bit more detail, because I'd like to just capture a few of the differences, as I said, across our study and those we've heard from and we'll hear about later today. As I said, we wanted to capture not only the level of isolation, obviously it's through subjective report, but I think gives us an objective description of social network size. And I'd just like to point out that at least in our study, we find that amazingly enough, and although it wasn't expected by me at least, only a very small fraction of our cohort are actually living alone. And I think, if I remember correctly, that sort of ties in more or less with some of the other studies. I thought I saw a smaller number, so 70%, but you can correct me if I'm wrong in the discussion afterwards. But then I also wanted to point out that, and the crux of sort of what we've tried to do in this presentation, but also in this study, is talk about who the touch is coming from, and we distinguish between familiar touch and incidental touch, touch that comes from a stranger in a restaurant or a bakery. You can tell I'm in Germany, we live in bakeries. One thing we won't be talking about today, but we're currently looking at is something similar to the sort of difference that Julia was talking about, the familiar touch of those cohabiting with us versus the touch of a family member who's out of reach. And I'd obviously love to tell you more about that data, but watch this space. I think the clear question that I sort of take away from this is, if you're like me and you're at home with kids and animals and a husband, why were we still missing touch if we're not actually alone, as 85% of our cohort reported being? And I think the obvious point here is that it is a reward mechanism at play, and it's the touch we crave, it's the touch we want that we may in fact be missing, rather than just an empty tank for touch that can be filled with anything. Then I said we want to just tell you a little bit about touch deprivation, both measured implicitly and explicitly. We did have the NAV-on attentional mode task. And I don't want to talk too much about that because it was phased out across the subsequent stages. But we do find some nice correlations between touch deprivation and attentional mode. If you don't know about the NAV-on task, again, we can talk about this later. But I want to focus on the longing for touch questionnaire that we used, because one of the points I'd love to get your feedback on is how to capture longing for touch, either implicitly or explicitly. And in the explicit form, we've been toying around with the basic components of this longing for touch questionnaire that you've heard repeated a couple times today. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, except to say that we create a quotient, or best let I'll tell us to create a quotient based on the kind of touch, the frequency of touch you've had in the last week from either a stranger or familiar person across different touch types. And then you get a second component, which is how much you would have wanted, a desire for touch. And it's indeed the quotient of these two that give us a sense of deprivation. But I think it's quite clear from what we've been seeing today, Julia's nice moving graphics for stranger touch, that the difference between the touch you've experienced from a stranger is very low because you've been shying away from it. I think that's sort of the main message we want to say. And then when you do a quotient of that, obviously you get a very large deprivation quotient for stranger, far larger than for familiar touch, which might skew you into thinking that this is actually the kind of touch that we're craving, that we're longing for. And I therefore I would love to sort of get some feedback on how you feel we should approach this capturing of longing for touch, as it will certainly be something relevant to us long after COVID, remembering that the loneliness pandemic preceded the COVID one by at least 3 years, according to the WHO. So we really need to think about how to quantify touch deprivation, both in implicit and in explicit ways. Then I told you we move mechanistically, thinking about this as being a reward mechanism at play. We look at people's touch preferences and also how much value they place in touch, with at least 2 different tasks in our online survey. One, as I said, is using the little body outline that we color from either turquoise for soothing or pleasant touch versus unpleasant or uncomfortable touch. And we look at this across different social categories. Today, I'm focusing in on familiar versus incidental touch. We did, however, also ask about self-touch, and we can talk about that if you are interested. And then in terms of how much value we place in touch, we wanted to capture how much people imagined a touch to the face, to the back, or to the forearm would be pleasant, and how vividly that experience would be possible to create. Wondering whether or not that might be something that changes across time. Are people less able to vividly remember and recreate a sense of vicarious touch as amount of touch frequency goes down, perhaps in cases of significant isolation? And obviously in the background here, as I said, we've tried to capture, looking at that where factor, where on our body and where CT innovation is greatest, looking across more social zones like the back to more intimate zones like the face, and then looking at the forearm across these 3 different tasks, looking at the best longing for touch, our version of the embodied pain task, and then the vicarious video task that we've heard about today, and which I'll refer to Susanna Walker's paper on the so-called hedonic homunculus. And then lastly, again, taking into account that we can't really speak to causality, at least within a single phase. That's obviously one of the hopes with the longitudinal study, that we see whether or not we're coping or not without touch, and how we're coping with or without touch. I'm not going to talk about compensatory behavior here. We do see some self-grooming changes as a function of gender. I've got a slide on that if time permits and if people have questions. I'm going to focus instead on the impact on mood and well-being. And specifically, as I said, we've captured that with very simple, straightforward subjective ratings, the limitations of which I am obviously very aware, but we do get some nice results, which I'll hopefully tell you a little bit about. And lastly, and so please hold on, we've almost reached the results section. Like others, I do want to let you know that we have tried to capture various covariates of interest, and those range obviously from age and gender, like other people, people's individual preferences for touch, the social touch questionnaire. One question might be whether, in fact, these individual preferences are flexible over time. One limitation of the longitudinal study, where people were re-invited for subsequent phases, although we do have some new data from participants who hadn't participated in previous stages, which I can talk about as well. We only capture the social touch questionnaire once. So there's a big glaring issue that I'd love to hear back from, whether we assume that the individual preferences are fairly stable across time. We then, obviously, being a cross-cultural longitudinal study, we want to think about what role cultural norms play in our touch behaviors. And I'll talk a little bit about some of that data as well. Turning now, finally, I thank you for your patience, to our results. Obviously, one of the key questions we've all been talking about and that we've all been interested in probing is the relationship between touch and well-being. Now, as I said, long before the COVID pandemic hit, we had a problem with loneliness, and cleverer people than me started to draw a link between not only self-isolation, but what self-isolation basically means, which is that we're being deprived of certain social stimuli. And obviously from animals, and fairly early on, a model was put together of sensory deprivation as a model of self-isolation and resulting sort of lonely behaviors. And then from Robin Dunbar's group, we got some nice data, almost coincidentally with the start of COVID, that indeed physical contact can act as a protection mechanism, can reduce feelings of loneliness. However, the specific link between, in humans, sensory touch deprivation and loneliness had not been created. So with our phase 1 data, and indeed we're now seeing that trend across all 4 phases, is that when we create Bayesian regression models, including the following predictors, how much touch people are actually getting, how much touch they want, some of the covariates we talked about, gender, age, these individual preferences for touch, the social touch questionnaire, and whether or not they're isolating. Having well-being measures as an outcome, we see, and this is the one key takeaway, that loneliness or dissatisfaction with companionship is significantly predicted by these predictors. I just wanted you to see that we sort of see a similar trend across loneliness and sadness, specifically that it seems that those individuals who are receiving familiar touch less often are lonely and sadder. So it's not to do with touch overall, otherwise we might have seen it with the predictor LFTQ, often stranger, just seen above, LFTQ, often familiar. And then there is also a gender effect, which we can certainly talk about. However, like some of the other studies shown today, we clearly have a bit of a bias in our sampling with a very large proportion of females. So it's something to think about. Then in terms of what touch means to us, we want to sort of tell you about 2 things. One is that a model of how much touch you want from familiar individuals, your baseline individual preferences for touch, and indeed how vividly you can simulate these vicarious experiences of touch, predict higher imagined pleasantness. One of the things we're obviously looking into now is how that changes over time. And unfortunately, I can't tell you anything about that today, but I will definitely be happy to share that with you when and if that data, once we finish collecting phase 4 data. The second thing I want to point out is, and this has sort of been the crux of my message to you today, is that it's familiar touch. Familiar touch is what seems to be driving the changes in how much touch means touch, how much we miss it, and the impact this has on our well-being. And I think this is a nice way of illustrating that there is indeed this two-sided nature, that while familiar touch is the thing we're craving, that is prompting us to color these little body images in blue, we have the exact opposite behavior for strangers. And if you zoom in on the hand zone of even these stranger bodies on the far right, you'll see that we don't even want to shake hands with people, and that's obviously why we have fist bumps and elbow rubs. And this is to try and capture that this who context, but also the where contextual factor somehow interact. And thirdly, we show how that interacts as a function of whether you're in isolation at that moment in time. Lastly, because I see that I have about 3 minutes remaining and I don't want to gobble up too much time, I did want to tell you a little bit about both some of the cross-cultural similarities and differences that we're capturing, as well as just highlighting the fact that there is more to come with regards to some of the longitudinal data that we've been collecting. So the first point, and I hope that this is fairly illustrative in the top left-hand quadrant, I'm going to make sure I have a mouse, is that this is for how much touch you are craving, so the want factor of that longing for touch question, and how much you're getting is compared to the mean, which is this dotted blue line, that actually across cultures we look extremely similar, except for China. Now, this is phase 1 data. So one caveat is that China was already outside of, had just come out of their lockdown, which preceded our own here in Europe, and certainly some of the other cultures that we're capturing here across this spread. However, we're now looking at some of the subsequent phase data, and it looks remarkably similar. The other similarity that might not have been expected, and I only know of 2 studies where these sort of low and high touch cultures are compared. The social touch questionnaire, which we take as sort of this individual preference baseline, is not significantly different as a function of culture, which I was very surprised by. However, this is at phase 1, and I've mentioned some of the limitations with regards to capturing social touch questionnaires across phases. I'm trying to see if we have enough data to see if that is on average, not within an individual, but on average changing as a function of the COVID pandemic spread. It would be very odd to find that, in fact, we had reached a sort of ceiling at the end of phase 1. People had sort of been pushed to their limit, and everybody sort of had similar preferences as a function of that. There are some differences. As I say, China sort of looks very different in terms of how much touch they want and receive. But when we do compare traditionally assumed low and high touch cultures, Hispanics with, say, Anglo-Americans, we do see some differences in terms of their level of loneliness. We see that relates to their longing and indeed how much frequent familiar touch they're receiving. And we do see differences, and this is again where one of the points in which China sticks out in terms of how pleasant imagined touch is perceived. So that might be something we can think about as well, that there are certainly cultural differences to be explored. Lastly, I just want to show you that we are currently processing, and I tried to quickly download the most recent phase 4 data, which we're really in the middle of, and I'm happy to talk about this. The top is changes in those mood ratings or well-being ratings of companionship, so loneliness, lethargy, sadness, and stress over time. Sadly enough, stress seems to go up, and I think that's the way we all feel. And I think loneliness, we need to know that happy with companionship is high, whereas loneliness is low. And we see people are actually getting lonelier over time, which the small peak here might be that some people in phase 2 over the summer, when things relaxed, at least in continental Europe, people saw each other again, felt less lonely. But then unfortunately, things have deteriorated since then. And we see very little change in terms of pleasantness and vividness, but I'm still running some statistics on that, comparing for some of the controlling for some of the covariates I mentioned, and I'll let you know about that. And lastly, and very briefly, I just wanted to tell you that for anybody who wants to continue collecting data like this, we've heard about the app. I also want to tell you that we have created a jpsych tool developed by Justin Sulik, one of our co-authors, which you can use on the gorilla.sc experimental platform for the and probably very likely event that we'll have to continue collecting data online, at least for some time. Here are some options for you to continue doing some of the work that we've been hearing about so much today in your own format. So if you want to hear about either of these tools, do let me know. Lastly, I just want to thank all my collaborators and the people who have helped look at the data, collect the data, rally recruitment, and to my institutions that have allowed me to do so many of these crazy studies over the last few months, and to you for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you, Merle. Thank you so much. That's really interesting talk, really interesting data. It's so amazing to see that these studies have actually, we've been able to do studies like this in the lockdown. Maybe it's pushed us to do these big open studies where we've had thousands of participants. It's really quite amazing that such nicely designed studies have been able to be conducted like that, because they've all been done at the last minute. But it's really nice how you brought out the pandemic before the COVID was actually loneliness. And I do very much agree with that. And maybe that is partly due down to the internet. We speak to people more on the internet than before. And so maybe is the internet creating our loneliness? It's also helping though, isn't it? It's not just that, because we can still speak to each other, things like that. So if anyone's got any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But
I'll just pick up on that point you mentioned about, internet. And I think a lot of, so first of all, we do see an age-related effect with the younger participants feeling more of the burn, as it were. Participants. Our rationale, or our sort of our understanding of that data, but also basically all of our data, is that it all relates to expectation. Again, implying a reward mechanism that clearly is expectation based. The idea there being that younger people at uni, locked up, who expected to have parties and meet girlfriends and boyfriends and interact through touch in this developmental phase where we need to widen our social circle to build that prefrontal cortex. Clearly, their expectations were high, and their actual
the reality.
Exactly. So I think expectation is really key there. I think the internet, for better or worse, can sometimes either moderate expectations in the positive or the negative direction, and so it's not all bad. However, I think one of the key questions that we want to ask longitudinally is, how long can you live on expectation alone? That I'm finally going to get to hug this person I haven't seen in a year. How long can you hold on? And that's sort of one of the worries about that stress trend and that loneliness trend, that they're going in the wrong direction. I am more and more certain that we'll probably need another data phase of collection in 6 months' time to see some of that.
And I think it's true that, and it's exactly that actually, that we crave more and more this familiar touch, and we want less and less that stranger touch. And that was a really nice aspect I think you brought out there, that we do very much crave that kind of familial touch. We have a question here from Julia. Super interesting as always, Merle. I wonder if you collected any data about emotional bonds between the participants and the social network members they coloured.
So I think this is such a great question, and of course it came from Julia. So I'm actually creating a tool now to capture social network in a slightly more complex way because of the work I do on coordination. In this particular case, we simply know whether they're living with them at present and whether they would feel comfortable being touched in that little cartoony way, which I think is a very superficial way of saying, are these in-group or out-group people, and are they the people you usually coordinate, through touch with. However, what I'm building now, and if you want to help, I'm building a network structure where you can determine number of agents in your circle, determine whether they're family or friend, determine whether how strongly you connect with them. And I'm using the Lubin social network scale as a basis for that. And to do it all graphically, so you can sort of create these little nodes very nicely, color them for gender, and then pull them closer or further away from you to give some sort of, I think, implicit sense of how close you feel. So this is the job at the moment, because I think you're absolutely right, Neely. We need a better way to capture how close we feel to people. What is the nature of that bond, and how much trust do we place in them? This is a comment I've had from Annette Shermer, which I think is just spot on. That trust is so connected to these concepts of threat, defensive space that I've been talking about in the years.